Ladies and gentlemen, I will now commence the annual general meeting of the British Astronomical Association 2022. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm the president, if you don't know, David Arditti. And the first thing we have to do is to tell you that the minutes of last year's AGM have been posted on our website, and maybe you have read them, but maybe you haven't. Can I have your approval that those minutes are correct? Are there any objections? Everybody's in approval? Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Now I will invite the Treasurer, Jeff King. This will be his last AGM. He is handing over the treasurership to Graham Winstanley, who will be announced as being elected shortly. But Jeff is going to give you a review of the accounts, please.
Thank you, David. Right, let's start. Right, the full financial results, which is 22 pages of closely typed information, which I'm sure you've all read, is posted on the BAA website for all those who wish to read it. Some detailed, well not detailed, extracts have been put in the JBA that came out in October, and you may have read those, but I don't expect you would have read those either, unless you're really dedicated to this. Okay, so, but once again, we've had a very successful year, and David's going to talk to you most about the successful year, but I'm just going to talk from a financial point of view. And our total reserves this year, or the year ending at the end of March, increased by 70,000, just over 70,000. Now that includes both monetary and tangible assets. And the end of the year, our total reserves are £1.69 million, okay? Now, most of that is driven by the increase in our long-term investments. As you'll see in a moment, they are key to what we're doing. Okay, so the detailed numbers are like this. So last year's numbers are in the middle column here. The year I'm talking about are in the left-hand column of numbers. So you can see that our income for the years really hasn't gone up or down much. The expenditure went up a lot by 40,000, and that's mostly driven because we've invested a lot in the new website, which I hope you've all appreciated, which is, in my opinion, a lot easier to use than the previous one. So the gain or loss, without any talking about investments, £99,000 we lost. If we take off the bequests, which was another £22,500, we come up with an operational loss of £121,000 for the year. So that's without any investment income, that's without any bequests. So that's £10,000 a month we're spending more than we get in. Okay? Now, that was just pretty much by happenstance exactly the number that we forecast would be on that line when we started the year, because we knew that actually we are a charity. We're not John Lewis, we're not Harrods, we're not even Iceland. We're not here to make a profit. We're here to support amateur astronomy or all astronomy. So I'm not particularly that worried that we keep making an operational loss. This year, our investment gains were £165,000, meaning our net movement of funds was 70,000. Now, for those of you who are eagle-eyed and do lots of mental arithmetic, you'll have noticed those numbers don't actually add up. There's £4,000 floating around that isn't in there. And the extra £4,000 is because our tangible assets got revalued for an extra £4,000. Okay, so the difference here would come out to be 66, but the net movement went up by 70 because we got this extra 4,000 as a revaluation on tangible assets. So our total reserves at the end of the year is this £1.69 million, which includes some tangible assets. So the total gain during the year is 70,000. Investment gain that, bequests 22,000. Last year our bequests were about 31,000. So we come up with this 121 grand loss. Reserves carried forward that, which includes tangible assets. Now, at the beginning of the year, the tangible assets were 25,000. We sold a whole bunch of instruments, which are included in that. We sold, according to the book value, we sold £16,000 worth of telescopes, but we got almost £22,000 for them. So you can claim that they were undervalued in the first place, if you like. And with the extra 4,000 revaluation, we come up with tangible assets of 12.6, which means in monetary numbers, we've got £1.68 million in various places at the end of March 22. Okay, so that's the position. If you want to go through all the detailed numbers, I would refer you to the JBAA, or if you really want the detailed numbers, go to the website. So we continue to enjoy a very healthy level of reserves. You could claim that for an organisation of our size and for our regular income, that level of reserves is too big. From a charity's point of view, that's probably very close to the hairy edge of you need to get rid of some money. Because you shouldn't be accumulating money, you should be supporting what your charity is supposed to do. So our operational monthly losses went up, mostly because we invested a lot more in our new website. And we are forecasting that this 121,000 will come down substantially during the current year that we're in. Okay. So, has anybody, that's as far as I'm going to go, unless anyone's actually read all the details and has questions or has questions on what I just said. Yes, sir.
Could I ask about the investments? I mean, I was surprised to see an investment gain, but then I suppose March 21 to March 22, March 21 things might have been a down because we're still in lockdown then, but that's still a good gain to have for the year.
It's actually a lot less than the year before, where it was 210.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then we were from March 2020, of course.
Right.
It's probably struggled a bit since
Yeah.
March. Have you got any comment to make on it? Because
Okay. Since the beginning of this session, i.e. the session we're in now, so for, what have we done, 7 months of it, something like that, the value of those investments has gone down by about £95,000. That's since Mr. Putin did his thing. Actually, 60,000 of that decline happened since the 23rd of September. They are now recovering. So it's very, very fluid out there as to what the effect of what the government's up to is on that thing. But certainly they're down at the moment, but they could recover a little bit, or perhaps a lot more, depending on what happens.
and do you know what the spread of assets are, the asset classes we invested in are?
I don't have it off the top of my head, but if you go to CCLA, it's all written out there on their list. Yeah.
It's a CCLA Standard Investment Fund.
I'm sorry.
It's a CCLA Standard Investment Fund.
Well, it's the Charities Investment Fund. We're in the accumulation part of it rather than the income part of it. Yeah. Yes.
I mean, you said last year we had too much money. What, for our size, would be a reasonable amount of monetary assets?
Okay, if you take, let's go back one. If you take our total expenditure and you claimed we had no income, right? So we got to run this company, this charity, with no income 3 or 4 times the expenditure with no income. So about $1 million maybe. Okay. I think that's it. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff.
I guess you want to do
Okay.
something else with this, and I will not screw it up for you. I
Have you
must
taken
say,
it?
I've never...
You've got my piece of
I've taken your
paper,
bits of
yes,
paper as
yes.
well, haven't I?
You
You try
have
and screw
those-
it up for him.
No, that's your bit. Oh, you could
There's
use it
my
all now.
bits. There you go. That's mine, then. Right. I have to leave you now, I'm afraid. I've got to drive through the night to Holyhead. Get an early morning ferry. So, have a nice evening.
Thank you very and also, we need to give a vote of thanks to Jeff because he is retiring as president this year. He's been president for quite a few years, 5 years, and he's always been extremely helpful, extremely pleasant to deal with, extremely patient with all requests and highly competent treasurer. We've been really lucky to have your services. So thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you. I'm now going to summarise our past year, and the year I'm dealing with is since the last AGM. We always mention deaths of members at this stage. We've had 36 members died this year, and probably most notable was Ron Arbour, who was a former vice president, director of the astrophotography section, and founder of the Deep Sky section, also founder of the Commission for Dark Skies, a very respected telescope engineer and discoverer of supernovae, and we all very much miss Ron. We also lost this year another former section director, Ken Medway, who was a prolific solar observer. He was a director of the solar section. He won the Stevenson Memorial Award, and he observed the sun for 56 years, and he contributed to observations to the solar section every month. So those are the two deaths that I want to note. Also, of course, this is our first London meeting since the death of Queen Elizabeth II. We've already held silences at the Elgin meeting for her, but we'll hold a minute's silence now to remember Ron Arbour and Ken Medway, and also Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. So at last year's AGM, we had our first meeting since lockdown, and we had Alan Lorraine, the outgoing president, gave his presidential address on observing artificial satellites and space probes, and that meeting was live streamed to our YouTube channel, and we've been doing that for all the meetings for the last year since, to make sure that people who cannot get to our meetings in London can see them, and they can see them later. They're all recorded there on YouTube. We've preserved our excellent relationship with the IOP. They're continuing to allow us to use their facilities. Unfortunately, they had a problem with the building early last year, and that meant that we had to move 2 of our meetings to other locations. We couldn't hold the Christmas meeting here, so we had to hold that at the Royal Society of Medicine in Wimpole Street, and the January meeting we had to hold in the London Irish Centre. At Christmas, we had a talk from the Astronomer Royal for Scotland, Professor Catherine Haymans and Sarah Russell from the Natural History Museum, and I presented some awards. I presented the Sir Patrick Moore Prize to Howard Parkin and Mary McIntyre, who are seen there, and also to a couple of people who won awards during the lockdown, Dale Holt and Alexandra Hart. For the March and May meetings, we were back to the IOP, and we had lectures from Jacqueline Mitton, who was former editor of the journal, expert on the history of astronomy, and also from Martin Lewis, who's there, who's one of our best planetary observers. And in May, we had the George Alcock Memorial Lecture, and it was Mike Fawkes on that occasion talking about great storms on Saturn. After a gap of 2 years, the Winchester Weekend came back in April, BAA Winchester Weekend, and that was expertly managed as usual by Anne Davis and Alan Dowdall. And we had the Alfred Curtis Memorial Lecture, which was given by Dr. Stephen Wilkins, although that's not a picture of it. This is a picture of the one-day meeting in Leeds, which was in cooperation with the Leeds Astronomical Society. Looks a bit empty there, but that was taken towards the end of the day when they were emptying out. It was rather grand surroundings of Leeds University Concert Hall. And that meeting also had been delayed by 2 years by COVID, so we got there at last. Also in April, and that's all that got out of order, but that's the Winchester Weekend, and that's all the gathering at the Winchester Weekend. In April, I attended a unveiling of a plaque in South East London to the founder of the association, Walter Maunder, finally got an English Heritage plaque, and the plaque also commemorates Annie Maunder, his wife, who was also an important astronomer and an important figure in the founding of the BAA. At the May meeting, we awarded Clyde Foster the Stevenson Memorial Award, and we awarded Dominic Ford the Horace Dall Medal and Gift, though neither of those have actually been presented yet, and Clyde Foster is in South Africa, so we probably won't present it in reality, but I'm hoping to get him on a Zoom call sometime in the future to tell us about his work. And there they are. That's Clyde Foster in his observatory in South Africa, and there's Dominic, who has done a lot of work on the BAA website over many years, and he set up this very clever system we have where you can upload your observations and they get plate solved. They get automatic coordinates on, and we know what they are, and they're all catalogued. It's an amazing system. So that's what Dominic Ford got the Horace Dall Award for. We held another meeting out of London. We had the June summer meeting, was held in Nottingham University in cooperation with Nottingham Astronomical Society, and that had the subject of cosmology, galaxies and exoplanets. So everything in the universe was covered there. And I was able to give Andrew Robertson his Sir Patrick Moore Prize that he won in 2021. And I also, the day after, I was able to visit Nottingham Astronomical Society's observatory just outside Nottingham. And there's a picture of that, of me inside that, with members of that society of all ages. And they're doing great work there in public outreach. The final meeting of this session was the also 2 or 3 years postponed autumn weekend meeting held in Elgin in Scotland. Very successful. About 60 attendees, mostly from Scotland, but people came from as far afield as London and the south coast of England. And that was on the subject of a sun and its solar system. And on that occasion, I was able to present Lynn Smith, Section Director of the Solar Section, who lives in Scotland, with her Walter Goodacre Medal, which is the most prestigious medal of the BAA. She won that in 2021. And as I say, a great success. So we owe a great deal of thanks to Hazel Collett and her husband Graham, indeed, for all the work they do going around the country organising those meetings. They organise the meetings here in London, but a tremendous amount of work goes into planning those outer London meetings, out beyond London meetings. And Hazel has told the council today that she is going to retire as meeting secretary at the end of this year. So please, will you give your appreciation for Hazel for all the fantastic work she's done. Well, a feature of the lockdown was the webinars, short meetings, short lectures, discussions on the web through using Zoom and YouTube. And we decided to continue those even after restarting live meetings because they're a very good method of covering some of the more technical topics and having a discussion between experts. And we open those to members and non-members alike. We consider those part of our public benefit. And we've covered all sorts of subjects, all sky cameras, observing satellites of planets, silvering mirrors, lunar minerals, and the radio astronomy section has been organising many events on Zoom as well. You can see those all on the BAA YouTube channel, along with videos of all the live meetings, or nearly all of them. The YouTube channel has greatly expanded in the last few years, so I urge you to look at it. Our other big web offering, the website, that has been moved onto a new platform. That's been migrated to the WordPress content management system, and that new version went live in March after a lot of work behind the scenes from a team involving Dominic Ford, Callum Potter, Andrew Wilson, John Shooter, Emily Bick. It's had a few teething troubles, but I think overall it's easy to use. It works on all devices, which the old website didn't work very well on mobile devices. And I think it presents the association in a good light. It's got our discussion forum on there, and as well as the complete archive of the journal, which you can search, and that goes all the way back to 1890. On to administrative matters. An empty room, a very significant empty room. The BAA moved out of Burlington House entirely in April 2022, and that ended an 80-year history of the BAA having its headquarters in Burlington House, Piccadilly. So my thanks there really to our office administrator, Madeline Davey, for organising the departure so efficiently. We either kept the office equipment or we gave a lot of it away or recycled it. We got rid of it all. The staff now work from their homes. The registered offices of the association is now the office of our accountants. It is not really our office, and we have a PO box which you would write to if you wanted to actually send us any correspondence on your membership or astronomical matters, and then that would be forwarded to the appropriate person in the association. The archives, we have valuable archives which were stored in Burlington House. They've been transferred to a more suitable, climate-controlled, properly regulated environment in a specialised archive facility in southeast London. And there's an ongoing project to digitise as much of that material as possible, and it will be made available to the members through the website. That they could also see it by arrangement with the archivists actually in person if they needed to. Some of the archive is already online, such as the Lantern slide collection, which was digitised by John Shooter and colleagues, and including these slides which definitely show what Venus doesn't look like. But some 19th century ideas of Venus there, which I thought were rather quaint.
I think they're Lowell's drawings of Venus on the rides.
Are they?
Lowell put canals not just on Mars, but
Yeah.
on everything.
I don't know, I can't tell who they're by.
So Lowell on there.
Yeah, I think the one on the left is M. Nicholas.
Yes, the one on the right's lower though.
Right. Our collection of historic instruments, we retain a few of the instruments that have specific links to members of the association, but most of our instrument collection has been sold. I have to report that sadly, we are still necessitated in taking further action against the former curator of instruments, R.A. Marriott, as many items in the BAA instrument collection still remain unaccounted for. As far as the sections go, there's been one change of personnel. Paul Hearn, who's seen there on the right, he's taken over as director of the radio astronomy section from John Cook. We extend our thanks to John Cook for all his work. And thanks also to the rest of the board and council for all the work they've done over the last year. There was one change in the Board of Trustees. Lynn Smith resigned from the Board of Trustees in January, and she was replaced by the board by Trevor Parsons. Next session, or this coming session that's just starting now, the board remains unchanged except for Graham Winstanley will take over as treasurer from Jeff. From council, Mary-Louise Archer will stand down under the 3-year rule, but she remains active in organising things in the association, including she's journal advertising manager. There's a journal. Philip Jennings, our editor, has fully maintained the standards of this publication this year with the assistance of Jeremy Shears, paper secretary. And thanks also to Steve Harvey and his team for the computing section's work on the handbook. Now it's in its 102nd year of publication. Our membership at the end of this September was 2,559. That's 2% down on the same point last year. I'm concerned to ensure the long-term relevance and viability of the association. And with this in view, the strategy group, which is a committee of council members and non-council members, has been meeting throughout the last year, virtually meeting, chaired by me. We've been discussing the long-term vision for the association and the steps that we should take to get there. The recommendations of the strategy group have been given to council now, and they will be discussed next month. And I hope some of them will be put into practice within the next year and beyond, and that we will be able to continue to develop the association for the future and respond to members' needs and keep the association vibrant and thriving. That is my review of the year. Would anybody like to ask any questions about what I've said?
Just what's our membership number? Sorry.
It is 2,559.
Thank you.
We've had an election, and I will. Oh yes, another question.
Well, I think we should also thank Janice, because she does the newsletter, which
Good point.
we mustn't forget.
No, I did forget. I did.
Reminds us what's happening, and I think is that just a part of what she does. So I think we should mention.
Yeah, well, Janice has quite a few jobs. She's been manning the BAA stand last week at New Scientist Live, which was a very busy event. So yes, thank you very much, Janice, for. Let's give her a round of applause. Got that newsletter out month after month, yes. And she does the comment. Are you still doing the comment section newsletter as well? Yes. Yeah, that one as well.
Yeah.
Can we have a round of applause for that as well?
No, that's yes. I had a question over here.
Yes, regarding the future of the association, you've clearly got an action plan, which I don't think you've published yet, but it's certainly be interested to read when it is published. Regarding something I think, well, I had a conversation with you about a year ago, is whether the association is too biased towards practical astronomy and not against theoretical astronomy. And there must be a lot more people out there who don't have the time or the inclination for practical astronomy. I put myself in that, actually, but I'm extremely interested in the theoretical side of it. And maybe some sort of more balance between the two might attract more members.
That's an interesting point. So, yes, so that the view is there that we need to cater for and provide material of interest to those who are interested in theoretical subjects. The results of the election for board and council, is Bill here? Yes, Bill will give us these results now.
Okay. I don't think there's a slide, is there?
No, there isn't a slide.
In that case, I shall read them out. Okay, we had the election. Results are as follows. President David Arditti, 457 total votes, that's electronic and paper. Vice President Alan Lorraine, who is ex officio Vice President. New Treasurer Graham Winstanley, 448. Business Secretary Bill Tarver, 435. Papers Secretary Jeremy Shears, 464. And the Meeting Secretary Hazel Collett, 447. We come on to the trustees. Anne Davis, 391. Jeff King, 281. Janice McLean, 395. Richard McKim, 389. And Tim Parsons, 265. And for the council, 3 new members: David Boyd, 431. Alexandra Hart, 390. And Mark Stokes, 358. There were a total of 424 valid digital votes and 74 valid paper votes, making a 498 in total. 14 were invalid, either through being void or people had left the BAA or they were blank. And I'd like to thank the scrutineers of Ballot, Maddie Davey, Jane Rickard and Julia Palmer, and thank Andy Wilson for managing the electronic voting and making sure Civica did their job. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. A couple of ordinary items of business to do. I'll notify you of the next few meetings. There is an exoplanet workshop on Zoom online on 12th of November, and details of that are on the website. That's all day, I think, pretty much. Our next meeting here will be the Christmas meeting on the 10th of December at 1400, Saturday 10th of December, and you must book for that because we're limited in the number of people we can get in here, and it's always popular. So if you want to come to that, please book up. And we're planning a social event after that, which you will receive details of when you book. And the next meeting after that will be on the 21st of January, and that is another Saturday meeting. So that will, again, be at 1400 at the Institute of Physics. We've had some papers approved for publication in the journal at the council meeting today, and Jeremy Shears can tell us what they are.
Thank you, David. There were 3 papers accepted by council this afternoon for publication in the journal. 2 of those are by Richard McKim concerning oppositions of Jupiter, one in 1953 to 1954 and one in 1954 to 1955. And the 3rd paper that was accepted is Observations of Another Venusian Atmospheric Discontinuity, 2022 May to September. This is a short paper by Richard McKim and Paul Abel. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Are there any new members here today who've never been to a meeting? Oh, yes, Ken. Well, I was going to say I'm going to greet the new members, but actually I know Ken very well because he's been in Wallace.
Been to your place.
Yeah, and he's been to my house as well. Yeah. Well, welcome to the BAA, Ken. It's lovely to have you. Thank you.
What's your name?
Thank you for joining.
Ken.
Right. So we have a talk from Grant Privett. Unfortunately, Grant cannot actually come here today because he's got COVID, but he's recovering and he has agreed to give his talk anyway. So we've got his slides here and we've got, hopefully, Grant on Zoom. I will introduce Grant. Grant is originally a Londoner, but he now lives in Wiltshire. He's been in the BAA, or he first joined the BAA in 1971. He's also been involved with Shropshire Astronomical Society. Professionally, he was a physicist. He's now retired, and he specialised in imaging systems and data reduction. Since retirement, he's been a deep sky imager with a strong interest in variable nebulae, and he likes to see how far modest equipment can be pushed. He's written 40 papers and 100 magazine articles and 3 books. And he says here, he considers the combination of dry white wine, plain chocolate, and Dave Gilmour guitar solos nearly as good as a clear night. And he rarely goes to bed before 3 a.m. So a pretty typical BAA member in all respects. So let's see, there he is, Grant.
Do you want me to share my slides from this end or are you doing it from that end?
I think it will work better if you share your slides from that end.
Okay, I'll try it. See what happens.
Yes, we can see your slides now.
Right, I put the picture up on the basis it's possible you might not have seen me, and I wouldn't like you to miss out. That may have been one of the only occasions in the last 10 years I was actually wearing a tie, so yeah, don't expect to see me usually appearing like that. Anyway, I must apologise for my absence and the previous meeting which I wasn't able to attend. But do you want COVID? No, not really. If you probably had it already, but you don't want it again. It's not fun. Anyway, to proceed to the talk. I've just tried to advance the page and nothing's happened. That's interesting. Let's try that. I can't advance my page. Oh, well, something happened.
Yes,
right.
That's right.
Yay, we got somewhere in the end. NGC 6729 is a small fan-like nebula encompassing R Corona Australis and T Corona Australis, which are both variable stars. It's part of the molecular cloud in Corona Australis, which is forming various stars. Unfortunately, it's in the southern constellation of Corona Australis, as Australis is a bit of a giveaway, which is just below Sagittarius. So those of you who've been on holiday to the Mediterranean have probably seen it. If you've been further south than that, you've easily seen it. But really, from the UK, this nebula is hanging around about half a degree above the horizon. So you can't easily observe it from here. It's pretty small, but that seems to be quite common among variable nebula. It's 1 or so minutes across. And professionals are interested in them, but it's very difficult for them to get time to observe them. So it's very happy for us that Terry Evans has been deciding to image it and has been doing so for some years. It went forward a page properly, that's good. Anyway, so what are variable nebulae? I thought I'd give you a bit of background for those of you not familiar with them, because they are fairly niche. Simply put, they're a variable nebula that appears to change in appearance on timescales we're familiar with. So you may see a subtle variation in a few days, but more realistically, it's weeks or months, and occasionally years. Or you may see no change for quite some time. Or the thing may vanish entirely. They're like cats. They do whatever they like. They're quite interesting objects. And unusually, of course, for the deep sky, there's something that changes. Everyone takes pictures of, say, I don't know, the Andromeda Galaxy over and over again, and they all look the same. But with a variable nebula, you don't know what you're going to get, which is why they're interesting. And there's a talk on them, which is available from the BAA website. Just look for January 2022. It was Nick Hewitt. It was a good one. Well worth a look afterwards. Moving on, I may take this a little faster than I intended because I'm not sure how far my voice is going to last. So it could end up embarrassing. I could end up sounding a bit like Lee Marvin with a bad cold. And if I was with you, I'd do interpretive dance to finish it, but I don't think that's happening this time. So what do variable nebulae have in common? Well, they're all associated with young, unstable stars, which are pretty variable. They're pulsating. They've got big sunspots on them. They're still becoming what they will be. And they're surrounded or partially surrounded by obscuring dust and debris from the gas cloud they formed from. They usually have an accretion disk and an intense polar wind. Yeah, that's part of their characteristic, and it's the polar wind that allows us to see them, really. The polar wind rushes out from the star, tends to clear a void in the area above the poles of the star, and it's the inside of that void, the inside surface of that void, we tend to be looking at. It's not entirely true, but that's a good part of the gist of how we see them. And I should say, the polar flow that comes shooting out, it is particles that crash into other particles from the cloud, which get ionized. So you get ionized gas, and they create small objects with big arrows, which are worth a look. They're interesting objects in their own right. So, moving on again. Hey, you did it. Here's some examples. I don't get hung up on the orientation of these pictures. They're not north is up or west is east, or west is right or whatever. I've orientated them to show the similarities. McNeil's is at top right. That was discovered by J. McNeil in about 2004. And he was using a 76mm refractor. And he found this nebula in Orion, very close to M78. He must have been so happy when that happened. But it's a pretty thing, and it's based around a variable star, V1647, I think it is, in Orionis. And you can see it's sort of fan-like and pointing upwards. Bottom right is Garbadaghian's nebula, and I make no apologies for the spelling of Garbadaghian. That is how he spells it in an English paper he gave, so I'll go with what he says. He's an Armenian astronomer. He found this in 1977. And it's an interesting one. It comes and goes, and when it goes, it really goes. It's not around for quite a while. And it's very unpredictable, very interesting object in Cepheus. Bottom left, we've got Hubble's Nebula, NGC 2261, probably fairly familiar to all of you, well worth a look. It was known a long time before anyone worked out that it was a variable. I think Hubble found that in 1949. And again, it's a fan-like object. You see these four central objects all have a star at the bottom, a fan coming up from them, which is effectively a conic section. And the one in the middle is the object I'm talking about, NGC 6729. Picture from an Argentinian astronomer called Ignacio Bubillo. He does good pictures. And there's a little Herbig Harrow object next to it, the little hook type thing coming on from the left. And when you look at the object top left, which is Hines Nebula, which he discovered in the Victorian era, I can't remember exactly what year, with a 6-inch refractor from London. It must have been a very clean night because there was a lot of smoke around in London in those days. You wonder, well, what's the difference? How come that one looks so drastically different to the others? And the difference is, as far as I can tell, is that with the Hines Nebula, you're looking down on the top of the section that's been cleared by the polar flow, whereas the others, you're looking slightly sideways on at them. So it's not pointing at you, and it's not directly sideways to you either, perpendicular to your view, but it's inclined to some extent relative to you. And because they're sitting in on the edges of big molecular clouds, the other part of the polar flow going the other way, you're not seeing because it's embedded in nebulosity that is very attenuating. I think that I've read a figure for the attenuation in one of these nebula as 20 magnitudes, which is very large, I thought, anyway. So anyway, that's some examples. And I should say, something like Hines Nebula, it's a great object to observe, and it's very easy, and it's going to be around for the next 5 to 6 months. Anyone who wants to have a quick try at variable nebulae, it's a place to start. It's well worth looking at. So, and monitoring, what do you need? When it comes down to it, anyone can play. It's not hard. As long as you've got a camera and a telescope that will track, say, 20 seconds, you can image these things. It doesn't have to be a cool camera. They're quite easy to see. You don't need a big chip because they're quite small objects. The changes are subtle, so you tend to stack images to reduce the noise. And you do need to observe on a fairly regular basis. But really, people who say, oh, you keep on observing the same thing. Well, no one says that when someone observes a variable star. And these objects, I tend to observe them for about, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, stack up the images, look at it. It has a bit of change, and you should know in 15 to 20 minutes if there's change. I then usually go on for half hour and stop. If on the other hand something has happened, I'll go on longer because I want to see what the change is in detail. Because that's when it changes, it's really interesting. When it doesn't change, it's less so. So this is the sort of game that anyone can play. And one thing that's worth noting is the trend these days in the very best imagery is to have, say, 10, 20, 30 hours of imaging of an object to get a really, really deep image. And when you do variable nebulae, you automatically collect that much imagery eventually. After you've observed them enough times, you're sitting there with 1,000 images of the thing. So you do get a really nice image. And some of these objects are in very nice surroundings. So yeah, it's a double win. Here's an example. This is Nick's there. I hope it's flashing at your end. Is it flashing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, good. We got it working. Great. This is Garbadagin's nebula. This is two instances, two pictures of it. Other things happened in between those two dates. It went through a bunch of shapes again. Bits came and went. Bits got brighter. Bits got fainter. It's totally unpredictable. It's a very interesting object, well worth looking at. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's incredibly dim. It's been that way for, I don't know, best part of a year now, I think. But when it comes back very, very interesting. The star itself isn't terribly dim at the moment, which is good. It can go quite faint, but at the moment it's about, I think it's 15th or 16th magnitude or something. It's not stupidly dim. So this isn't a difficult target to image. I've imaged this with a 4-inch Newtonian, and it was a rubbish 4-inch Newtonian, and a starlight lodestar. It took longer because it was an uncooled camera, but I still got a fairly decent image, and I could tell whether it was changing or not. So it's not a difficult object to image, and it is rewarding, and it is totally unpredictable. Another example, Heinz Nebula again, NGC 155, I should say. This time by Richard Sargent, who's doing a very nice sequence of images on this object. And when I counted it, I reckon there's about 5 different parts of that nebula changing, obviously. Yeah, the background's shifting very slightly. The normalization of the twin images isn't quite right. But there's 5 different parts of that image that nebula changing, which is quite fun. And that's in, what, 2 months? 2 months. So that's not long. And if you look at the star, which is the star itself, T Tauri, which is a bit saturated, to be honest, in this picture, you see those little wings. There's one at about 6:30 and one at about 2, something like that, 2 o'clock. And they're real. Those are real features. That's not an artifact. Those are little bits of nebulosity that are just peeking out from the saturated star image. There's more detail going on in there. It's a very interesting object, and it's quite bright, and it's quite easy to spot, really. So it's well worth a try. It's interesting, and it's currently active. In fact, I don't know time when it hasn't been active, apart from about 5 years after it was discovered. It vanished for 30 years. So hence, these are variable nebulae. They're interesting. And this just give you a feel for the sort of environment these things live in. Again, this is the Ignacio Mobile, lovely image. There's lots going on. I really wish this rose higher in the sky in the UK. I would certainly be imaging a lot if it did. Unfortunately, it doesn't. But if we annotate that, there's a lot of stuff there. Yeah, I count it as one globular cluster, which we're lucky it's just outside of the obscuring molecular cloud. One dark nebula, one Herbig Haro, and 4 reflection nebulae, which is pretty good value for money for one picture. I think if that was above the horizon in the UK, it would be inundated with people happy to observe NGC 6729 for us. Unfortunately, it's not. Oh, and by the way, at the bottom right, the bright star there is the brightest W Ursa Majoris star, a variable type of star. So you really are getting value for money with that field of view. And it's just pretty, to be honest. The colouring is lovely. Oh, I've gone too far. Let's go back. Oh, can I go back? Yes, I can go back. Good. The imaging is being done by Terry Evans. He's an experienced imager. He observes NGC 6729 using a telescope he has hosted in Australia. It's an 8-inch refractor. You can see it in the picture on a paramount. He takes multiple images of about 60 seconds, and he refocuses every few images. I mean, every few images. I don't remember a time I've ever got an image from him that wasn't in focus. I've had a few that are saturated because the focus was so good, but very few that are out of focus. It really is nice imagery to work with. And because he's very careful about it, we're in a position where we can do some fairly intensive processing on the data he's collected. He collects data every few days. And in addition just to storing them and looking at them and making movies, he does inspect them visually for outbursts. He goes through every frame, compares it to the previous night's frames, and looks at it and says, well, is the nebula brightening? Which bits are brightening? What's going on? Is anything happening? Because sometimes, you get unexpected periods when you think, well, it should have brightened by now, and nothing's happened. So again, it's an interesting object, and the visual assessment of the images is in many ways just as useful as anything we do with computers later. So it's a very nice system in a good dark location in Australia. So what were we trying to achieve then by just not visually inspecting images? Well, the thing with variable nebulae is it would be nice to have numbers for them. It's very nice to say, oh yeah, it varies. And then someone says, well, how much? By how many magnitudes? And you think, well, I don't know, actually. Comes and goes, this bit does this, this. It would be nice to have numbers for some of this. So we did some work a little while ago on Galbadargian, but moved on a bit from that. We're trying something different with NG6729. And unlike some of the other nebulae, it's never been known to totally vanish. In all the time there are records for it, no one's ever said it's not there, which is quite nice. So it's slightly more predictable in some ways than some nebulae. And it has been observed by other people. And the variable star has been fairly well observed as well. There's huge numbers of recordings of the brightness of Archrona australis from things like superwasp. There's loads of data out there, and so you can get a good idea what the variable star was up to before you start trying to process anything. The only downside is the data Derek collects is unfiltered, and in that area the stars are significantly reddened, which you can tell from looking at the gear BP brightnesses compared to the Gs. So the magnitudes are always going to be approximate. We do our best to mitigate the effects, but it's always going to be a bit approximate here and there. There's no way around that. So anyone who wants to can doze off at this point. I won't labour the point, and anyone who wants to can always email me or read the paper when it comes out. But we're fairly careful with how we do the data processing. We want to be consistent, want everything to be normalised so that there's no scaling funnies going on in here and messing things up. So you have to find a part of the image that's darkest, effectively where there is no starlight coming out. And that might be between stars. Alternatively, it might be in dark nebula, which is, in this case, is very nearly as dark. And then you have to choose some part of the image, nebulosity, that's a long way from any of the stars that are known to vary and appears to be unchanging. There's no record of it ever changing. And those give you some sort of scaling for the frame, which is quite nice. In addition to that, you can use the pixel count in stars to tell you what that scaling is in terms of magnitudes per arc second. Because you know how bright the star is, how many counts came from it. So you know that if you spread that across pixels, how bright would those pixels be? So that's one thing, which gives us effectively means we've got the brightness of the nebulosity in magnitudes per square arc second using gear for the whole frame. Which is a nice position to be in. Yes, there'll be errors on it. It's probably about realistically 0.1 magnitudes or thereabout. But we have some useful data at least to play with. And just to finish things off, we sample everything to the same pixel size, but it doesn't matter. It's the same. It turns out it's the same sensor all the way through, but we check that anyway. And then we align all the images. So we've got a stacked data set which is all aligned, and it's all converted into magnitudes per arc second, which leaves us in a very nice position for doing things. And I should say we can only do this because Terry is very careful with the imagery he collects, and in fact he collects it virtually every night. So what would we get out of this in the end? Well, the sort of chart you see at the top right, you're fairly familiar with when you do variable stars. You've got comparison stars, and you look to see if those are varying at all before you go any further. And I chose 3 at random. They were fairly isolated. There's nothing nearby that was going to smear into them. They weren't any steeply sloping nebulosity. They were very benign targets. And the plots for the whole of the year are there. That's roughly from March 2021 to November 2021, something like that. And you could make a case for the magenta and the cyan ones being slightly noisier. So I went with the middle star, and I'm using that as my reference point. The number of the stars, catalogue number of the stars in the paper. Emphasising again, there's no filters being used here, so this is all approximate. At the bottom we have something more familiar to everyone, I imagine. This is a light curve for our Corona Australis during the session. Pardon me. During the session. And as you see, it varies quite a lot. Yeah, it's going between, what, 10.5 and 13.1, something like that, which is quite a good range. It's not as regular as you'd expect. The observations from CISA suggest there's a nearly sinusoidal variation with a 65.797 day period. And when you look at his curve, it's really quite convincing. His superwatch data is really convincing. I think what's happening with that is it's sort of averaging things out, and all the dust obscuration and things going on that's temporary and short term is averaging out. So I think his period is accurate. It's just obscurations going on from all the debris floating around in the system that our Corona Australis formed from. So the nebula has rubbish in it, which is obscuring the light getting out sometimes, and casting shadows. It's doing shadow puppets onto the clouds around it, that sort of thing. Just to fill in the gaps, the period suggested the maximum should be appearing between the 2 red bars. So you're expecting a maximum somewhere around there. It suggests, if looking at the period isn't entirely right, there might be a little wiggle room. It might be slightly wrong in some way, but the bias is going to be pretty small because it's coming up fairly well. And the green lines are the observations where Terry looked at the data and said, I think it's getting brighter again. And those seem to be fairly consistently just before it really does get bright. So that's a fairly conventional light curve for the object. And obviously there's a lot going on in that system that is obscuring some of the maxima. So if you convert that to a phase plot, which is also fairly familiar from anyone doing variable stars, and you use that 65.797 days period, this is what you get. And it's not a sine wave, and there's a hint of a secondary maximum there, which CISA actually records also a very slight secondary maximum. And there's a lot of scatter, but it does look like there's something you could possibly squint a bit and get a sine wave out of. And if you look at it, the peaks are turning up roughly between the red dashed lines as expected. And Terry's very consistent with when he thinks the thing is starting to brighten. Yeah, when it gets to about, I don't know, when it goes above 12th magnitude, he knows it's brightening and it's starting to illuminate the stuff around it. So that does show the value of the visual assessment. It is surprisingly consistent. It's really quite good. Where was it gone forwarding? We'll go back there. So as I mentioned, I'm in a position here where we had data that all the images were aligned. We had the magnitude values for every single pixel in that data cube. And we can look down through each data cube, each pixel, and find out how the magnitude brightness varied along that time axis. And what you get is something like the curve at the top, which was, I can't remember where it was somewhere in the nebula. You just look down through it, and that's how the brightness varied with phase, with time. And as you can see, it isn't that far off a sinusoid. It's noisy as hell, but it's not that far off. So you could think, okay, you could plausibly fit a sine wave to that and possibly try and get some sensible numbers out of it. And so what I did was I chose a number of locations between R Corona Australis and T Corona Australis and said, okay, well, what's the amplitude of a sine wave you fit all along those points? I hope everyone's following this, all along these points. And what I got was a very nice straight line curve. If you look at the bottom curve, as I moved from R Corona Australis to T Corona Australis, the amplitude dropped, which is what you expect. You're moving away from the source of the illumination. It's dropping off a bit. Light's being dispersed, light's being scattered. There's lots going on. There's no reason to assume the gas is any more uniformly dense in different parts of the nebula. So a straight line was a bit of a surprise, to be honest, but it's a very welcome one. You're always happy when you get a straight line in your data. You think you've done something right. And after that, I tried varying the direction. I was looking away from R Corona Australis. So instead of looking straight from R Corona Australis to T Corona Australis, I was saying, well, how about 10 degrees higher up? Let's see what happens. Yeah, rotate it 10 degrees and see what happens. And it wasn't a straight line. It was a mess. I went the other way and it was a mess. And I started to think, well, in that case, there's a lot going on here. I just happened to hit lucky with the first one I chose. I really need to look at every single pixel on the frame. So what I did in the end was I took a chunk of the data cube surrounding surrounding the nebula. It's about 2 arc minutes by 2 arc minutes, so 4 arc minutes of sky, and calculated the phase plot for every single pixel. And you think, oh, that'd take a while. Yeah, it doesn't. Even in a rubbish language like Python, it got the whole thing done in 15 minutes. It's the programming took far longer. Running the program was short. Writing the software took a lot longer. But so I did that, and it means you end up with a phase diagram for every single pixel on the frame, which means you can have maps of the nebula showing how the amplitude varied, and also the time delay between light leaving the star R Corona Australis, getting to the piece of nebulosity, and then coming to you. So you've got effectively a light travel time thing going on. So if we go to those plots, it'll be perhaps more obvious. And here we are. The image on the left is the mean brightness of all the pixels within the area immediately surrounding the nebula. And you can see it looks very much like a bog standard image, and it should. If it didn't, I'd have been very worried at this point. But it looks perfectly decent. The star bottom right, bottom left is R Corona Australis. One above it to the right is T Corona Australis. So it's a line between those two that seem to be roughly flat. The image in the middle is where I looked at the amplitude of variation of every single pixel and plotted that instead. And it's not the same as the normal image. There are clearly differences. I should say, don't get hung up on the fact there's some dark stuff in there. There is a reason for it being dark, and it is meaningful. And we'll get around to discussing that in a minute. But why there's a dark line across T Corona Australis, I cannot work out. It's not my software. I don't know what's causing it. That's going to need some thought. And on the right-hand side, you've got effectively, for every single pixel on the image, the time delay between light leaving R Corona Australis, going to the nebula, a piece of the nebula, and coming to you. You can only do that so far away from the star because you start to get ambiguity as to how many phases it was. You know, did you go through a complete cycle or whatever? But we were lucky with this one. It peaked out before it got to that boundary. So we have 3 plots, and they're not identical. There are clear differences between them, so I needed to investigate that. And here's the middle plot. And when you look at it, you see R Corona Australis, bright variation around that, which is what you'd hope for. And it sort of tails off away from it, you know, particularly up towards T Corona Australis and slightly above it. And that's all perfectly sensible, and that makes sense. And there's some ripple features in there as well, which is nice because that's what Terry saw. And the dark area, I should say, is really that the software is creating a phase plot and fitting a curve to it, and is able to fit a curve amplitude that is smaller than the noise of the image. Because I've got so many images, I've got over 100 images, it can work down in the weeds and do that. And so the dark areas are where there was variation related to R Corona Australis, but it was very dim. It was below 0.1 magnitudes. I should have done something clever to suppress all the noise of the bits of the image that weren't varying in time with R Corona Australis. I didn't think of it till afterwards, to be frank. But anyway, we've got the situation where we've got about 0.75 magnitudes variation. And while we're looking at it, I noticed that the Herbig Arrow object, was also varying. I heard a report a while back that suggested that in the infrared it was known to vary, but I've not heard it being said that it varies in the visible. So that's interesting. It could just be a light leak out the side of the nebula, which is surprising because I thought it might be more obscured at that distance and at that angle, but apparently light is getting there somehow. Sorry, I'm losing my voice again. And it does beg the question, well, when we say we have a reflection nebula, if that star causing a reflection is a variable star, should we be calling that nebula a variable nebula? Because really it's got to be. Realistically, what we're saying is if you've got a variable star and it's illuminating a nebula, then that nebula will be variable. But we don't refer to them in that way. We just refer to them as reflection nebula. So, and finally, finally in sense of the major conclusions. Most of you have seen Hubble's variable nebula, and some of you who are deep sky observers will know that it has another lobe. Below the bright lobe is a dim lobe, and the reason it's dim is it's going into the attenuating molecular cloud. But it's very faintly there. I've imaged it a bit. People like Malin have done lovely jobs on it, and other people, and Adam Block have done great things with it. But it's there, it's detectable, but it's faint. Similarly for Galbadargians, the faint other lobe is there, but not very strongly. And the question is there one in NGC 6729? And we can't say for sure, but it's interesting that this little lobey thing labelled on the picture isn't a significant object in the main image. If we try to go back to that, if we go back to the original picture and you compare the lobe position in the time delay image with the original image on the left, there's nothing there. So it's interesting. It's not absolutely certain. Is that a lobe, or is it just a bit of, I don't know, a gap in the nebula illuminating some other piece of nebulosity nearby, allowing light through from the star? I don't know. I'm not sure how you would tell. I think it'd be tough. I think you'd probably need a much bigger telescope than we have access to, a stack of money, and probably some polarization filters or something, or some, I don't know, a radio telescope perhaps. I don't know. So to summarize how things have gone, realistically, we've learned quite a lot, really. We haven't done too bad. Given it's an 8-inch and we're working it fairly hard, we got a reasonable amount of information out. We got the photometry of Arca and Australis. We worked out how much nebula varies in brightness. We've mapped light travel times, which is, I can't say I've seen that done before, but yeah, it must be possible with other nebulae. We did notice that the period suggested by Scissor, the 65.797 days thing, maybe need a slight adjustment, or the error bars need widening, something like that. But it may just be that's a temporary thing, and if we look in 5 years' time, they've gone back to the right period again. We don't know for sure. Other things, we spotted evidence possibly for the location of the lobe of the nebula, but that needs much more evidence before you'd categorically say, yes, this is it. And really, all this is just down to Terry. If he hadn't done these observations, I wouldn't have been in a position to do anything with the data, and we wouldn't have got this good result between us. So what we could desperately do with it is other people pursuing objects like this and making long continuous data series. People like David Boyd, for example, have got data series that last several years, well, actually more like a decade, I think, in his case. And those are incredibly valuable sets of data, and they're very easy to create. So to conclude, the variation in NGC 6729 looks very much like a normal light echo. And we'll be able to show how the brightness varies across the nebula. The echoes have clearly been modified by what's going on deep inside the nebula itself, presumably somewhere near the accretion disk, which is about 1 AU from the star, it turns out. It's 125 AU away from us. Not AU, sorry, 125 parsecs away from us. So it's too far for us to resolve otherwise. And yeah, say these echoes have been modified, and it might be possible if we had enough data, if Terry was kind enough to go on long enough, that we could look at how the variation, how the peaks of brightness are suppressed over a period of time, and put magnitudes to it, which would be nice. I don't know whether that would be possible, whether the error bars are just too big. But it'd be interesting to try, and it's something I might play with in a year or two when we've got a bit more data. But at this point, I'm in severe danger of losing my voice. Everyone's probably fallen asleep. And so I'll hand over to the guys back in London and ask if there are any questions, please.
Thank you very much. Done very well keeping going there. Any questions for Grant?
Grant, Nick, Nick Hewitt. Are you going to continue to do this monitoring for the foreseeable future, or is Terry going to?
Last time I spoke to him, he seemed to be quite happy to keep taking pictures, which is great. As far as I'm concerned, that's brilliant, and they are nice quality images. Well, we've got some data back as far as 2018, but I think at that point he was still using a different telescope. But I think from about 2019, we've got a continuous series. And in the 2019-20 data, the obscuration was much more evident. The nice, pretty sinusoid just didn't happen most of the time. So it was an interesting time.
Thank you.
Jeremy.
Hello, Grant. Jeremy Shears here. Thanks very much for your presentation. Really interesting piece of work and a great paper that covers the results. So commend that to everybody to look at. Can I be cheeky and ask about one of the other nebulae that you showed, which was Hind's nebulae?
Yeah.
You showed the little loads. Do they change in location and appearance?
They don't appear to change in location, but they do appear to change in brightness.
Okay. At the same.
I must admit, I've not scoured the image. Well, I don't have Richard's data set, but I'd be curious to see what would happen if he scoured them differently to try and reduce the glare from the central star a bit.
Yeah, indeed, or perhaps even shorter exposures. I wonder if there's a nice piece of
Yeah. I must admit, I use a lot shorter exposure when I try and measure its brightness.
Yeah, very good. Interesting. Thank you.
Right, well, I don't know if anybody online has got any questions, because I'm not monitoring that. Is anybody monitoring that? No, we don't know. Right. Well, thank you very much, Grant.
No problem.
You've very impressive work, and really the kind of thing that is the essence of the BAA. These projects carried out determinedly by a small group, leading to some unexpected results. So thank you very much again, Grant. In the AGM, we normally have the presidential address, and that's what we're going to have now. So we need to switch back over to my lectern device. And I have decided to split my presidential address into two parts. So you're going to get the first part this year and the second part in 12 months' time, because I have over 4,000 years to cover in the history of the telescope. I will explain. I'll first ask you a question. What is a telescope? What is the definition of a telescope? Well, people may say it's an object for looking at distant objects, or perhaps it's perhaps it's a thing which magnifies, but that doesn't really cover all telescopes. If you think about a radio telescope, does that magnify? Not really. So the word actually means far-seeing. It's Greek for far-seeing, which is quite a good definition. My definition of a telescope would be that it is a device for gathering radiation from distant objects. I think that covers all classes of telescopes. And it's not, the essence of it is not that it magnifies, but it collects that radiation which has come to us from far across space. So it is Greek tele far skopien C. Where can we take this back to? Well, objects resembling lenses date back 4,000 years, but it's not known if they were used for their optical properties or if they were just jewelry, some kind of decoration. In the 5th century BC, we have Greek accounts of the optical properties of water-filled spheres. Then in the 2nd century, Ptolemy, who is also known for his theory of the universe, his Earth-centered theory of the planets, he wrote the first major work about the properties of light, and he covered the properties of light, including reflection, refraction, and colour. His theories were further developed by Arabic scholars in the 10th to the 11th century, especially by Alhazen in his Book of Optics, and that book became the foundation of optical knowledge throughout Europe, and it continued to be a standard text through the Middle Ages in Europe and into the Renaissance. Here's an English document, a diagram by Roger Bacon from the 13th century, and he's showing light refracted by a spherical container of water. So these concepts were being investigated and were understood in the early Middle Ages. There's a Florentine manuscript of 1289 which refers to glass lenses for spectacles, recently invented, it says, and these are great advantage to old people with weak vision. So we know that lenses for correcting long-sightedness date from the end of the 13th century, and this is very significant to the progression of the Renaissance. The fact that people's sight could be helped by such lenses whose curvature could be changed as the person grew older by making new spectacles for them. This had important effects on society at that time. It meant that the working life of scholars, of writers, craftsmen could be lengthened using spectacles. So it was important in the development of scholarship and the evolution of knowledge in the Renaissance and evolution of craftsmanship. There was a figure called Giovanni Rucellai, and he was a cousin in the 15th century of Pope Leo X. And he used a concave mirror to study the anatomy of bees, and he described that in a short poem, Le Api. Then again, there's a letter from a Neapolitan called Giambista della Porta, who lived in the late 16th, early 17th century. And he wrote a letter in 1586 saying that he could make glasses that could recognize a man several miles away. And he also wrote about using a combination of convex and concave lenses for improving long-distance vision, as he put it. So was he talking about a telescope? We can't say in the absence of new sources coming to light. These manuscripts are ambiguous, and the way they use words may not be the way we understand those words today. It's not clear whether they had invented telescopes at this stage, whether the way of combining convex and concave lenses had been used to form a telescope in the way that we know it. There are various hints. There's hints from English records from the Renaissance period, from the Elizabethan period, and in connection with the wars with Spain, and hints that British sea captains may have had some kind of device made of mirrors which could enable them to see ships on the horizon. There are hints, but no clear descriptions, no diagrams which would allow us to unequivocally state that the principle of the telescope had been discovered. The unequivocal evidence that we come to is Hans Lippershey's patent application of 1608, and it is the earliest indisputable documentary evidence of a telescope. Hans Lippershey worked from 1594 as a lens maker and spectacle grinder in Middelburg in the Netherlands. Middelburg became a centre for that kind of work. And in 1608, he made an application to the States General of the Netherlands for a device for seeing things far away, as if they were nearby. And his patent application was denied. And the reason it was denied was it was claimed by other opticians working in Middelburg that they already knew of this principle. So they claimed that this was general knowledge and Lippershey hadn't invented it. But Lippershey was not daunted. He did file a successful patent application. He just put two of them together and invented binoculars. So his telescope consisted of he had two designs. He had either two convex lenses with an inverted image, or he had a convex objective and a concave eyepiece lens. And that gave an upright image, and he achieved a magnification of 3 times with that. There's a story that he had children in his optical shop, and one of them picked up 2 lenses and put them together and looked at a distant building and discovered the principle of the telescope, but it's a story. We don't know what really happened. But the story of how the news got out then and travelled across Europe is quite interesting. It's quite unexpected. The way this happened was that Lippershey's application for the patent was mentioned in a diplomatic report. At that time, there was an embassy to Holland from the Kingdom of Siam, all the way from there. And the Siamese king, Ithkarot, had sent this ambassador to establish relations in Europe. And it was in his report back to the King of Siam that this patent application was mentioned. And this report in 1608 got distributed across Europe. And it led to experiments by scientists in other countries, such as the Italian Paolo Sarpi, who received the report in November of 1608 and tried to make a telescope then. And an Englishman, Thomas Harriot, received the report. And he got his friend, the instrument maker, Christopher Tooke, to make him a telescope in the summer of 1609. And he was actually the first to use a telescope on a celestial object. When he turned his telescope towards the moon, he was working for the Duke of Northumberland, who had an estate at Syon House, just to the west of London on the banks of the Thames, and that was where the first astronomical observation with a telescope was made. And he beat Galileo Galilei by a few months to making the very first telescopic observations. The instrument wasn't called a telescope at that time. In England, it was referred to as a Dutch trunk. There were various terms for it. So the news reached Galileo in Pisa, I think, and he constructed a telescope. And he did better with magnification. He managed to build one 8 times magnification, and eventually he refined that, and he could make one with 20 times magnification. And that was the one that made the observations that he used in his great book, Sidereus Nuncius. He was using a concave objective lens, a convex objective lens and a concave eyepiece in a long tube. And the main problem with this telescope is that they had a very narrow field of view. It was like looking down a tunnel. His field of view was typically half the width of the moon. But he made a crucial series of observations over the winter of 1609 to 10, showing the craters of the moons of Jupiter, and the phases of Venus, stars of the Milky Way. And of course, the observations of Venus were critical in establishing the Copernican theory as a viable alternative to the traditional Earth-centered view of the planets, because he saw the size of Venus varying, he saw the size increasing as its phase decreased, which could only be explained if it was in orbit round the sun. Galileo called his instrument the perspculum. The word telescope was coined by a Greek mathematician who was called Giovanni de Massini in 1611. And in England, it was typically called a Dutch trunk or a perspective tube. After Galileo, other Italians took up building telescopes. And an Italian worker, although he's German by birth, Christopher Scheiner, invented the first helioscope, the first telescope specifically for looking at the sun. Galileo and other workers at that time had already discovered the principle of projecting a solar image. And Herriot has observed the sun also by seeing the sun when it was very low through mist over the Thames. But the reason I mention Christopher Scheiner is because he constructed the very first equatorial mount. It used a similar configuration to some of Tycho Brahe's instruments. Tycho was, of course, the last great observer of the pre-telescopic era. And this instrument had a polar axis, which you see here, and it was able to track, and it was manually pushed to track the objects in the sky. And this was the first equatorial mount. Galileo's mountings were either some kind of ball and socket arrangement or just a hook, essentially, just a free pivot on which he suspended his telescope. They were very crude. The next major development is due to Tycho's assistant and his successor, Johannes Kepler, known for his laws of planetary motion, of course, but also he wrote on optics. And in his work, The Dioptrice of 1611, he described a system where the concave eyepiece of Galileo was replaced by a convex eyepiece. And this gave an inverted image, but it gave a much wider field of view. It had its own limitations. The limitation of the Keplerian design was chromatic aberration, the splitting up of the colours into the spectrum at the edges of objects. With the moon, you would get a red edge and a blue edge due to the different colours coming to focus at different distances from the objective. And the only way to overcome this at that time was with lenses that had very long focal lengths. So if you had a less curved length with a very long focal length, then the colours will all come to a similar focus. So this started a period when, to achieve reasonable magnifications, workers had to make their telescopes very long. Johann Hevelius was a beer brewer, and there seem to be quite a few beer brewers in the history of telescope making. It seems to be a subject that comes up from time to time. And he became mayor of Gdansk, or Danzig, and he devoted his time to building telescopes. He built an observatory in 1641 on the roof of his 3 connected houses. And some of them got very big. The biggest was a Keplerian telescope of 46 meters focal length, which is possibly the longest tube telescope ever built. It was made of wood and wire, and with that, he succeeded in observing sunspots. He mapped the moon. He discovered the librations of the moon. And he also discovered 4 comets. And he was the first to theorize that they were in parabolic orbits around the sun, although he couldn't prove it. And here's another of his telescopes. This is the 150-foot telescope. This didn't have a single tube. This was a framework, essentially. And you can see roughly, I think, in that engraving how it works. It's a series of apertures which define the light path going all the way up. And then there's the observer down there, and there's the eyepiece. These telescopes were sometimes known as aerial telescopes. Christian Huygens, who was also a pioneer of microscopy, He developed, with his brother Constantine, he developed tubulous aerial telescopes from about 1675 in order to use very long focal length objective lenses. And in Huygens' aerial telescope, the objective was mounted in a short tube on a swiveling ball joint, and it was on the top of a mast. And the eyepiece was in another short tube on a stand, and the two tubes were kept aligned by a taut connecting piece of string. And improbable though it sounds, he successfully used this work. He just successfully used telescopes like this to make the first map of Mars. He described them in his 1684 book, Astroscopia Compendaria. And he also made another big contribution to the field. He came up with the wave theory of light, in contradistinction to Isaac Newton's corpuscular particle theory of light. And here's the tubeless aerial telescope with a piece of wire connecting the eyepiece and the objective. And here's some of Huygens' observations. And he also discovered the rings of Saturn, which had been seen by Galileo, but Galileo interpreted them as satellites of Saturn. He couldn't really resolve the structure of the rings, but Huygens correctly described the nature of Saturn's rings. Similar telescope designs were built by others, including Adrien Azout in France, and he built a 600-foot long or 180-meter long telescope. And Azout briefly considered the construction of an aerial telescope 1,000 feet in length that he said that he would use to observe animals on the moon. But the leading producers of telescopes in the late 16th and 17th, early 17th century were Italians, such as Francesco Fontana and Giuseppe Campani. And they were centered in Bologna. And it was using telescopes by Campani that the red spot, well, Campani discovered the red spot of Jupiter, and he was able to measure the rotation of Jupiter using observations of the red spot. And he had aerial telescopes of 30 and 40 meters long. I'll now move well away from continental Europe up to Scotland, which was, had a thriving philosophical and mathematical scene. James Gregory, in the mid-1600s, he made major mathematical developments, and he worked on the calculus founded by Newton and Leibniz. And he designed the first reflecting telescope, but he wasn't an optical worker. It was a theoretical design. He could not build it. His design, the Gregorian telescope, placed a concave secondary mirror, you see there, with an elliptical surface past the focal point of a parabolic primary mirror. So the image was reflected back through a hole in the primary mirror. But Gregory could find no optician with the skill to construct this instrument. But he also considered the alternative design, which is now known as the Cassegrain design, which has a concave primary mirror and a convex secondary mirror. So he was actually the inventor of the Cassegrain telescope as well, judging from the notes that he made. But he couldn't build it. But his designs attracted the attention from several other people in the scientific establishment of the time, and Robert Hooke actually did succeed some years later in building a Gregorian telescope. But we have no portrait of Robert Hooke, unfortunately. He did all sorts of interesting things. He helped Wren rather, rebuild London after the Great Fire. Another person who is a bit shadowy is Cassegrain. Who was he? Who was the inventor of the Cassegrain telescope? We actually don't know. The only thing we know is that a French journal of 1672 contains a letter which reports that there is a man named Cassegrain who has written a note describing a new type of reflecting telescope. He may have been a priest called Laurent Cassegrain with those dates, but we're not quite sure. But around the same time, Isaac Newton had already published his design for a Newtonian reflector. And Christian Huygens wrote about the Cassegrain design, and he critiqued it harshly. And Newton also critiqued the Cassegrain design, and he said, let him try to make it. Now, Newton was a practical man as well as a great scholar. His Optics, published in 1704, is a masterpiece of experimental physics. He argued that the refraction and reflection of light could only be explained if light were made of particles, which he referred to as corpuscles. And he sought to disprove Huygens' wave theory of light, which Robert Hooke also supported. So Newton and Robert Hooke were at loggerheads over the nature of light. Isaac Newton, as we know, received a knighthood eventually, but that was nothing to do with his scientific work, whatever. It was for his work for the Royal Mint, as master of the Royal Mint, in ending the counterfeit currency epidemic that was in England at that time. And he identified the perpetrators, he got them sent to court, and they were let off because the counterfeiters bribed all the magistrates. So eventually Newton got himself made a magistrate, and he was able to try the counterfeiters himself, and he sent them all to the gallows. And that's what Newton got his knighthood for. It wasn't for his theories of physics or for building a telescope. So there's his telescope of 1672. Newton invented an alloy of metal called speculum metal, tin and copper, and he invented this to make his mirrors. He devised means of grinding and shaping these mirrors, and he invented the pitch lap used to polish the optical surface. He made his mirrors a spherical shape. He recognized that the theoretical shape was a parabola, but he thought that would be too difficult ever to make. And he made this telescope with a spherical primary mirror and a flat secondary mirror, and he found that it produced no color distortion, and he could see the Galilean moons of Jupiter perfectly. And he showed this telescope to a small group at the Royal Society in 1671. They were impressed with it, and they demonstrated it to Charles II. And on the strength of that, Newton got admitted as a Fellow of the Royal Society. So we had these very long telescopes, these very long Keplerian refractors. The achromatic lens was invented twice. Chester Moore Hall, around 1733, invented the achromatic lens, consisting of two pieces of glass of different refractive indices, one convex, one concave, so that the chromatic aberration due to one almost cancelled out that due to the other, and you could bring the rays of light almost to the same focus. But he didn't develop the design, and he died, and his account was lost. So he may have built such a telescope around 1733, but the knowledge got lost for 2 decades. And the principle was reinvented by John Dolland in 1757. And John Dolland actually patented the achromatic lens. And that put an end to the era of these very long aerial telescopes. Dolland at first believed Newton's theory of light, and he thought it wouldn't be possible to make an achromatic telescope. But the German mathematician Leonhard Euler had suggested that you might use a combination of glass and water lenses to correct for chromatic aberration. And so Dollond did experiments on this, and he came up with the combination of crown and flint glass. And he began to make these achromatic lenses commercially, and he became optician to the king in 1761, but he died the very same year, at age 55, so career very much cut short. But the company he founded, Dollond and Aitchison Optical Company, is still going today. So that was his great legacy and success. When the Hanoverian kings took the throne of England, they brought other Germans with them. And one of those was William Herschel, musician. He came to England as a musician. He worked in Bath and had a high reputation as a musician and composer and administrator of musical events. But he took an interest in astronomy. And he started building telescopes. Refracting telescopes were too expensive for him, so he built reflecting telescopes. He's best known, of course, for his discovery of Uranus in 1781. And he discovered that with a 6-inch telescope of his own construction. He spent up to 16 hours a day grinding the speculum metal mirrors. And the thing you have to understand with the speculum metal mirror is it tarnishes very quickly after only a few months. And then you have to repolish it. And when you repolish it, you remake the surface. So you have to retest the surface. It's a highly laborious business. You're remaking the whole optical surface again whenever you repolish it. He developed his own devices to help test and grind the mirrors. He invented a grinding machine. This is a telescope of a similar design to the one with which he discovered Uranus. It may or may not have been this one, because he built quite a few of similar design. It's an altazimuth built of wood. It has slow motions to push it gradually up and gradually across. A limited range of movement in azimuth to move it a long way to other parts of the sky. You had to pick the whole thing up. And here's his mirror polisher, preserved at the Herschel Museum in Bath. And of course, he had the assistance of his sister Caroline. And she wrote about the pouring of the mould for a 30-foot focal length mirror. And a day was set apart for casting, and the metal was in the furnace. But the furnace began to leak at the moment when the metal was ready for pouring. And my brother and the caster with his men were obliged to run out of opposite doors. This was in a domestic residence they were doing this. And the stone flooring blew up and flew up in all directions. And you can still see that broken flooring in the Herschel Museum at New King Street, Bath today. But he tried again, and he made a successful second casting for that mirror. His biggest telescope was referred to as the 40-foot telescope at Slough. He became, on the strength of the fame that he got discovering Uranus, he became astronomer to the king, not astronomer royal. That was a job for mathematicians at that time, not for people who built telescopes. But he had a special job that he was given, invented specifically for him, of a king's astronomer. He went to live near the king at Windsor, and he constructed this huge telescope at Slough. It's of a similar design with the altazimuth to what we've seen earlier, just scaled up. And he was using the Herschelian observing position with no secondary mirror. And this was to save on the light, because you were losing about 50% of the light in the first reflection, another 50% of the light in the second reflection. And that was when the mirrors were relatively fresh. So you didn't have much left at the end. But so if you could eliminate the secondary mirror, you would retain a lot more of the light. So with a big telescope, he reasoned, just sticking your head in the front of it, that should work. That won't block out very much of the light. It won't affect the image. There is a bit of an aberration because you're not viewing on axis, you're slightly off axis. But with the long focal ratios that he was using, that didn't make that much difference. So that was the Herschelian observing position that he was using. But his 40-foot telescope wasn't a great success, and he did his most successful work with the 20-foot telescope. And with his later telescope, he mapped the stars of the Milky Way. He deduced that the sun is in motion, and he realized that the sun must be towards the edges of the Milky Way. So he was the founding father of stellar astronomy. And of course, he catalogued all the nebulae, nebulae which later formed the NGC catalogue. They were mostly his discovery. I mentioned Jesse Ramsden because he's a bit of a neglected figure. He developed a better eyepiece, a better achromatic eyepiece. The achromatic eyepiece, it was an improvement on the Huygenian design, and there's the optical arrangement of his eyepiece. And he also invented a new type of mounting, the English yoke equatorial mounting. And this is the only portrait of Ramsden. It shows him in front of a dividing engine that he constructed to make other instruments, such as surveying instruments, very precisely. And behind him is the great circle that he made for Palermo Astronomical Observatory for measuring the heights of objects, the altitude as they transit the meridian. And it shows him in a fur coat. And that's because this painting was commissioned by the Tsar of Russia. The Tsar employed Ramsden for working on navigation and surveying for canals. But Ramsden never actually wore the fur coat. And there's a telescope that Ramsden designed. This was the Shuckburgh telescope in Shropshire, and it was probably the first English yoke mounting with the polar axis running up from a low polar bearing to a high polar bearing, and then the telescope suspended in a cage, free to move in declination. The earliest form of equatorial mounting was actually invented by an English clockmaker called Henry Hindley in York, and that was the English cross-axis mounting, which was very similar to Shiner's mounting from 1611 that I showed. But Ramsden altered that design into this form, which had no counterweight. And this telescope was later used at the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, and it's now in the Science Museum today. In the 18th century, other equatorial designs were built, such as this one, which is the oldest telescope in an observatory, which is still in its original observatory, certainly in the UK, I think, and probably the world. This is the Troughton 2.5-inch refractor of 1795, and it's a feature of telescopes at this time. They tend to have big mechanics, a lot of mechanics, and very small optics. Very small telescope in a lot of mechanics. And the reason for the complexity of this is because they were trying to combine two jobs in one instrument. They were trying to combine the job of a transit instrument, which measures the times that the stars transit the meridian, and also combine a telescope which could look at all parts of the sky. So it was built by Troughton with this complex brass yoke mount, which we actually saw when we went there for a BAA meeting in 2019. And the telescope part is just that part. The rest of it is the mounting. This is what a conventional transit telescope looks like. This is the one at Sydney. They're usually fixed between two really solid pillars so that they can only look at that exact established meridian direction and they won't move at all. And so you get accurate transit timings. Next important figure in my story is Joseph von Fraunhofer. And he's a very interesting figure. He did so much. He was born in Bavaria, and he had the bad luck to be orphaned at the age of 11. And he was apprenticed to a glassmaker. In 1801, the workshop in which he was working collapsed, and he was buried in the rubble. But fortunately, he was rescued, and the team was, the rescue operation was led by the Prince Elector, Maximilian Joseph. And the Prince Elector realized that this was a very bright boy. He took a liking to Fraunhofer, and he became his patron. He paid for his education. Fraunhofer went on to improve the making of lenses. He invented precise measurements for measuring the properties of glasses so that he could match them for their chromatic properties. And he made batches of glass that were more consistent than any made before. And he also invented a machine for grinding lenses. It was in the process of measuring the optical properties of the glasses that he came to the idea of using standard light sources. And it was in observing those light sources that he first observed the Fraunhofer lines and so established the field of spectroscopy. And there's an engraving showing him observing the spectrum of the sun. And he detected the Fraunhofer lines, the dark lines in the spectra of the sun and even in some bright stars. And he built complete telescopes, most famously this one, the Dorpat refractor at town which is now called Tartu in the modern state of Estonia, 9-inch aperture, built in 1824, of wood and brass. And this had the first German equatorial mount, which Fraunhofer invented, the type of mount with the counterweight. And this became very much the pattern for high-quality telescopes in the 19th century, long focus, achromatic refractors on equatorial mounts built of brass. Fraunhofer was not an astronomer. He was a practical optician and an engineer. And he said that in all my experiments, due to lack of time, I could only pay attention to those matters which had a bearing upon practical optics. The English were still attached to the English equatorial mount, to the type that had been developed by Ramsden and others. And here's another example, the Northumberland telescope in Cambridge, which you can still see today, built in 1833, originally 11.6-inch aperture. The original lens has been replaced. This has an English yoke mounting by Airy. And the mounting is in wood. It's tensioned with iron bands on screws, and they say that the last person to tension those up was George Airy himself. It's at Cambridge University Observatory. There's the driving end of the polar axis, and is famous as being the telescope with which James Challis failed to discover the planet Neptune in 1845, even though he had been given a correct prediction of its position by John Couch Adams and Airy, possibly, but the whole story is disputed, and Airy actually disputed the idea that he had a practical set of predictions. He claimed that Adams' handwriting was indecipherable. There were different versions of the story. But Neptune was not discovered with this telescope. And there's the rather ingenious observing chair that slides up and down that you can still use today, which is the original one. And there's the observatory, which was the first domed observatory in England, designed again by George Airy. And Airy also designed this telescope, which was mounted up at Greenwich in the 1850s, a 13-inch refractor, again on an English yoke mounting, the type that Airy favoured. And these yoke mountings are very, very stable, but they're a lot of construction involved, and you cannot view the polar area with them. And they're really only suitable for refractors. But it was difficult to make large lenses, and William Parsons realised that some objects in the sky need a lot of light to grasp to really analyse what they are. The faint nebular objects in the stellar sky, you could do with a bit bigger objective. And so he pursued the specular metal mirror idea. He was an aristocrat of in the British Irish Protestant nobility. He became president of the Royal Society, and he became an MP. And he built a succession of telescopes at his home at Burr in Ireland, starting with a 15-inch, then a 24-inch, and finally a 36-inch, finally the great 72-inch telescope. There's the 72-inch telescope in a 19th century photograph. This was the very largest telescope built in the 19th century. You see it's suspended between two brick walls. It can only look close to the meridian. It's basically similar to Herschel's designs. It's alt-azimuth, and it required a team of men to operate. It was in use up to the 1870s, and then it decayed away. It was very hard to keep the mirrors in good polish. They actually had two sets of mirrors. But famously, Ross made drawings of the galaxies, and he discovered the spiral structure in Messier 15, the Whirlpool Nebula, and other galaxies. The telescope weighed 16 tons, but it could be operated by Lord Ross plus 2 men. We're back to brewing. William Lassell made his money as a beer brewer in Liverpool in the heyday of that port as the hub of the British Empire. He was able to sell an awful lot of beer to the dock workers, made his fortune, and he was an amateur astronomer. And he started to build large reflectors, and he realized that the mountings that had been used by Herschel and by Ross were really unsatisfactory, and you couldn't follow the stars properly. You couldn't really get good long views of objects at high magnification. So he pioneered the use of fork equatorial mountings, and he also realized that he needed to take his telescopes out of the bad atmosphere in the industrial north of England. His 24-inch telescope he had in Liverpool, and he built that with the help of another industrialist, James Naismith. And Lassell invented his own steam-driven grinding machine for grinding and polishing the mirror. And with that, with a 20-foot focal length telescope, he managed to grind that specular metal mirror to better than a quarter of a wavelength of light, and he was able to discover the moon of Neptune, Triton, in 1846. But to get better conditions, he moved to Malta, and he built a 48-inch reflector in Malta. So not as large as the Ross telescope, but much more effective. It was a much more modern-looking affair. There it is. Not a good engraving, but we can see this is a very different standard of engineering, a much more modern style of engineering, all built of metal, and able to look at all parts of the sky, operable by one man. It's a far more practical style of engineering. This is a Newtonian telescope, so you have a kind of looks like a kind of elevator that the observer is in there. Lassell eventually left Malta, returned to England, and he broke the telescope up, rather than having it, as he said, falling into unappreciative hands. So sorry for the people of Malta, but he didn't seem to have a very high opinion of them. Different designs were developed by different figures around this period. James Naismith, who I'd already mentioned, who was the inventor of the steam hammer and made a lot of money in the industrial north, he invented a fixed observing position telescope called the Naismith design, Naismith type of Cassegrain, where you could sit in one fixed position and look at an eyepiece, which was looking at an image reflected in a tertiary mirror in the middle of the telescope, and that allowed you to control those wheels that you can see to drive the telescope around while sitting in a constant position. Very, very comfortable design. But this is more typical of what became the standard observatory telescope in the mid-19th century. This is one of the instruments built by Thomas Cook and Son of York. This is the Fry refractor, which you can still see today in its original state in Mill Hill Observatory, University College Observatory in North London. Thomas Cook of York was famous for the high quality of his refractors. He built the whole instrument, including the optical parts, the mechanical parts, at a time when many instrument makers only made one or the other. He made both the optics and the mechanics. But there are some very eccentric designs in this period in the quest to build a bigger refractor. The Craig telescope of 1852 was briefly the largest refractor in the world. It was financed by Craig was actually a rector. He knew little about astronomy, but for some reason he decided that England should have the largest telescope or the largest refractor in the world, and he commissioned a couple of engineers, James Rennie and William Gravatt, to design this telescope. But unfortunately, those two engineers, although they were distinguished in their field and they'd both worked with Brunel on his steamship and railway designs, they also knew little about astronomy. And they came up with this extraordinary thing where this telescope is slung in a hoop and the observer has to travel round on rails. This telescope proved to be of little use. So although much better mountings had been invented, there were still some very eccentric experiments at this stage. So I've mentioned that what was really holding reflecting telescopes back was this need to repolish the speculum metal mirrors very frequently, every few months, and completely remake the surfaces. And all the light losses that you got, even at best, they were never more than 70% efficient. A Swede, Carl August von Steinheil, founded a company in 1857 to make telescopes and other instruments, including photometers. He also invented the photometer. And he approached the man on the right, the German chemist Justus von Liebig, and he asked Liebig if he could develop a technique of depositing a thin film of silver on glass, good enough to make mirrors for telescopes. And Liebig was able to develop blemish-free mirrors by adding copper to ammonia, silver, nitrate solution, and sugar. And in 1856, Steinheil wrote, using Liebig's method for silvering glass mirrors, layers can be deposited which are so good that even the rear of the mirror, even the rear of the silver forms a perfect mirror. As a result, if normal glass is ground on one side to an exact spherical concavity, still doing spherical mirrors, not parabolic, an exact spherical concavity, it can be silvered to give a telescope which, even if it tarnishes over time, can be restored with very little effort, as the exact shape is preserved by the glass. So that was the big breakthrough. The exact shape is preserved by the glass. You would just recoat it when it tarnishes. And he made a 4-inch telescope, which he said showed a marvelously clear, bright image. And he started manufacturing them. And his telescopes had so many advantages over metal specula that they rapidly caught on. They were easier to make, cheaper to make, lighter, but it didn't happen overnight. And other workers continued to insist on the superiority of speculum metal for several decades, even as late as the 1870s. Sir Howard Grubb, who had worked with Parsons on his big telescopes, he continued to argue that speculum metal was better into the 1870s. But Steinheil's silver on glass telescopes gradually displaced speculum metal. In France, Léon Foucault built a bigger one. He built an 80-centimeter silver on glass Newtonian, and he famously developed his test for parabolizing the glass surface of the mirror before it was silvered, which was a major step forward. And of course, his test is still used. and if they'd used it before they put the Hubble Space Telescope into orbit, they would have saved a lot of money. In England, the idea of reflecting telescopes, silver on glass reflectors, was pioneered by a couple of men with beards, George Wythe and George Calver. They became the leading English makers of silver on glass mirrors in the late 19th century. Wythe only made the mirrors, but Calver built the tubes and mounts as well. Calver built his first 10-inch in 1864, and he vigorously promoted the practicality of the Newtonian designs for amateurs, for the people who would go on to found the BAA. And he was largely responsible for the popularity of Newtonian reflectors in England that went on right through the 19th and into the 20th century. And Calver caused a sensation in the telescope building world by offering to build a telescope with a 100-inch diameter. But he needed somebody to pay for this, and nobody was prepared to do that. That offer was never taken up. But the closest we got was this telescope. Henry Bessemer, the inventor of the Bessemer process for making steel, another industrialist, he decided to build a 40-inch telescope, silver on glass reflector, which was the largest silver on glass reflector attempted up to that time. And he built this telescope at Denmark Hill in South London, fully steerable on a type of altazimuth yoke mount. The mirror was made by George Calver. It was the largest glass mirror attempted up to that time. It was not a great success, and it was initially a 50-inch mirror, though Calver's mirror was initially a 50-inch mirror. It was not a great success. It was replaced by a 40-inch mirror, and there were even two 6-inch refractors used as finders, two 6-inch Cooke refractors used as finders. So you can imagine how much that set him back. But he'd invented the process of making steel, and he was a big tycoon. This telescope weighed around 12 tons, and it was in a dome of 36 feet diameter, rotated on bearings. But it seems never to have been really finished or operational. Sir Henry Bessemer died in 1898, and at that stage, the instrument was offered to the British Astronomical Association, and they declined the offer. And on that point, I will pause my talk for 12 months, and we will continue the history of the telescope at the AGM of 2023. Thank you very much. Any quick questions?
I just have a quick one, David. You mentioned that they were still grinding spherical surfaces rather than paraboloids. Did they end up with parabolas by mistake, though? Because
yes, I was actually reading the original paper by Foucault, which does seem to be saying that they had made parabolas, but they hadn't quite known what they had made. And Newton recognised that the parabola was theoretically what you're aiming at. But it wasn't, there was no test that was easy to do to get the parabola right. So, yeah, I think they were already making parabolas sometimes, yes. But it hadn't really been clearly laid out what was required. So, I've even got a third talk today. I've got to do the Sky Notes now. I'm running out of.
Balance just barely.
Not too much, no.
I'm running out of voice, but this will. I'll keep this very brief. I'll just do a very much a highlight Sky Notes for October. We've just had an eclipse yesterday. I could have, and there's already loads of images on the BAA website of this. I could have chosen any of them, but I've chosen this nice set by Mike Harlow from Ipswich. A lot of us had clear weather. That's what I had in Edgware. and there you can see some sunspots there and a contrail from an aircraft. But just to show that it did look different from different places, here's images from Cyprus by my correspondent Agapios Elia, and you can see, because Cyprus is a bit further east, the sun occulted a bit, the moon occulted rather, a bit more of the sun, and there's images in hydrogen alpha and in white light. There's been a lot going on in the sun in hydrogen alpha. In October the 2nd, I took this picture in hydrogen alpha with this really big, amazing loop of filament there. And high level of activity of the sun, of course, corresponds to aurorae, and there's been aurorae reported. Here's an image from Denis Brzezinski at Tarbert Nest, which is nowhere near the northernmost point of Scotland, to correct something that I said in a previous meeting. And that was, the date of that is September the 22nd. So what's this? What's this? This is something you don't see every day. Yes, this is Didymos, minor planet 65803. Peter Carson got this image on the 14th of October, and it shows the debris trail after the impact of the DART probe into the surface of Dimorphos on September the 26th. So there we've got a BAA member with a small telescope is able to detect the effect of a probe or object, spacecraft, sent from the Earth and sent to interact with an asteroid, and that can be seen with a small telescope. So that's incredible. Other prominent objects in the sky at the moment are, of course, the planets. We've got a splendid display of the planets. We had a dust storm on Mars. These are my images taken with my 14-inch telescope. The left-hand image shows some evidence of the dust. It's in this area. It was changing quite fast, and only a few days later, it's changed and the dust is no longer apparent. And of course, Jupiter dominating the evening sky. Here's a fantastic image from Martin Lewis from St Albans, showing the non-red spot side of Jupiter, taken with his home-built 18-inch Dobsonian. And he's one of the leading planetary imagers today. And he's given talks here, of course, as well. And we wouldn't be complete without an image from the master, Damien Peach. He took this during his trip this year, and he went with Ian Sharp this year to Barbados, where they have very good seeing, and he observed Saturn and Jupiter, of course. And here's an image of Saturn showing a little white spot in the northern pole, towards the pole, north temperate region. And September the 21st. And just to show that you can observe deep sky objects from the middle of London, here's an image of Messier 31, which I took. And Messier 31 goes right overhead in the winter months. So light pollution on all sides balances out. So I was able to get quite a dark effect in that one. And that was taken with my 66mm refractor, a very small refractor, and that was 16 two-minute exposures unguided on an astrophysics mount taken during September. But what's this? This is a radio observation, and this is also a first. John Cook, who's former director of the radio astronomy section, writes, members of the radio astronomy section have detected a gamma ray burst. And this is the strongest gamma ray burst ever detected. It occurred in the afternoon, and it was received by various people, and it's distinguished from what you would expect if it was a solar flare. The image, the thing at the top is the curve of a solar flare, trace of a solar flare, and you get a nearly curved start. and a curved minimum in signal strength, and that's an ordinary flare. But the gamma ray burst looks different.
Battery is low.
Oh, well, that's charging up. I'll talk about the planets, which are in the evening sky. You've got, first round is Saturn, which is transiting now in the early evening. And Saturn is going into the evening twilight. It's coming to the end of its period of observation. But Jupiter is transiting now about 10 p.m. and is as bright as it possibly could be. It has been closer to the Earth, the closest to the Earth that it can ever get. Largest angular diameter was about 50 seconds of our diameter, and the magnitude has been up to nearly magnitude -3. Next round, you've got Mars and, well, emitting Neptune, which is somewhere in between. Mars is now transiting in the early morning, about 4 a.m. It's coming to opposition in December, but this is an apolitic opposition, so it is a distant opposition, and it is only attaining, I can't remember, something like 10 arc seconds.
17, I think.
Oh, it's more than I said, 17.
So David, whilst you're waiting for your battery to charge up, that gamma ray burst event was really interesting, because what people were seeing, I think, was that the X-ray flux from that gamma ray burst affecting the Earth's ionosphere. So essentially they were seeing disturbances in the ionosphere caused by something halfway across the universe.
Yes, it was being conducted all around the Earth, between the Earth and the ionosphere, yes.
Yeah. Just got to hope we don't get one much stronger in future.
The moon, that's what the moon is doing. There is a solar eclipse on. No, we've had the solar eclipse. Yeah, we've just had the solar eclipse. There's a lunar eclipse on November the 8th, but it won't be visible at all from the UK. So here's where the planets are. Saturn, then Neptune is the next round, then Jupiter, then Uranus is very well placed as well. Uranus is attaining 55 degrees high and coming to opposition on the 9th of November. And the moon passes close to Jupiter on the evening of 4th of November, only about 2 degrees from Jupiter, and similar happens 1 month later. Yeah, similar happens on 1st of December, but on 1st of December the pair will be at a much lower altitude. So on 4th of November the pair are at quite a reasonable altitude. But more spectacularly, there is going to be, on the same day that Mars is at opposition, on December the 8th, it will be occulted by the moon. And the moon will be full, of course, since both objects are in opposition to the sun. And as seen from London, Mars will disappear at around 5 a.m. and it will reappear almost exactly at 6 a.m. And that simulation shows what it will look like. It will disappear near crater, that dark crater. That's Grimaldi up there. So that will make some very good opportunity to image Mars and the Moon and observe and time that occultation. Of course, the timings will be slightly different depending on where you are. Quite a few meteors around this time of year. The Orionids are still going. They're going until early November. They are a reasonable shower, ZHR of 20, and they're favourable this year. They maximum on 20, which we've just had really, corresponded to a new moon. The Leonids, a very famous shower, have their maximum on the 18th of November. Leonids have produced spectacular meteor storms in past years, but they're not expected to do anything very much this year, and also moonlight interferes this year. And then the richest shower of the year is the Geminids in December, maximum, I shouldn't say maximum 14th of November, the maximum is at 14th of December of the Geminids, and they have a zenithal hourly rate of in excess of 100, but unfortunately we have moonlight this year as well. And finally, I'll just mention, publicise my local society, and we're doing some public observing in early December, and so if you're in the London area and you want to look through a telescope, or you want to come along and help us show things through telescopes, show the public the moon and planets, we'll be doing that on Friday the 2nd of December, Saturday the 3rd, Sunday the 4th of December, if it's clear. With that very brief sky notes, and sorry about the battery running out during that, that will conclude, unless anybody can think of any other announcements that they'd like me to make, that will conclude our meeting for tonight, and we'll see you, many of you, at the Christmas meeting on the 10th of December.